You know who you are. Good is never good enough. Great, well, that's just petty and middling. You won't settle for anything other than the absolute best. Today, I'm going to show you how to take your run-of-the-mill all-in-one liquid cooler all the way to 88 miles an hour at 1.21 gigawatts, all in the Cooler Master NR200. Howdy again, and welcome back to Machines and More. Hope all of you are doing well, and thank you for the great feedback and questions from all our viewers. This is the de facto part 2 of the liquid cooling deep dive that I just did, featuring the Cooler Master NR200. If you haven't checked out the video, feel free to check out the vid right up here. This is going to be a continuation of that one, where I'll explore a few more configurations in order to hone in on the best way to run an AIO in this case. Now, part of this deeper dive will also be applicable to those of you that are using different cases, especially other small form factor cases, since the restrictions and relationship between the CPU and GPU thermals is common to many SFF cases. Today we are going to get to the best possible arrangement for a side-mounted AIO in this case, both from a money is no object perspective and also from a best value perspective. So I hope you'll find this interesting and perhaps inspiring to see how you can maximize your AIO liquid cooler performance. Before we jump in, I just wanted to address a couple of viewer questions and a few installation tips. The first relates to 200mm rads. Now, Sky Nabo, one of our viewers, asked if an Arctic liquid freezer 280 would fit, and I would think yes. There is enough clearance to fit the thicker radiator. Typically, your AIO rads are around 30mm, but the liquid freezer series features a 38mm thick radiator. You definitely have 8mm of clearance in this case, but not having one myself to try out, my only concern would be how much pressure would be on the radiator tubing. The other limitation, and this is to Andre A's question, is that mounting the 92mm fan is unlikely when you're using a 280mm rad. With the 240mm rad I tested, there was less than 30mm of clearance between the rad and the 92mm fan. So the extra 40mm or so on average will most likely interfere with that fan compatibility. Now, that's not a big deal, as we'll soon explore an option that really makes a much bigger difference. As for radiator positioning, in my opinion, the best way to position the rad, since you have only two ways in this case, is with the barbs on the PSU end of the case. There's a little notch to the right of the PSU shroud, and that really helps with letting the tubing curve as gently as possible. I would place it as close to the right end of the panel as possible, so long as you're not blocking any fins. There's a sweet spot where the tubing will gently slot into the space there between the PSU shroud and the front panel. And what you really want to do is avoid any kinks in any liquid cooling scenario, since it will compromise liquid flow, and probably the bigger issue is increase the possibility of leaks, since those fittings will have undue pressure applied to them. Now, placing the barbs over the CPU pump block just places too much stress on the tubing for no apparent gain. Since a lot of head units on AIOs feature cables that connect up to RGB headers, USB headers, and the like, connect those first before installing things like the graphics card, and even the head unit itself if clearance is tight on your motherboard. On the X52, you can plug the cables in and then hook it up once the pump block is on. Now, fans work more or less the same in terms of airflow, whether they're pushing or pulling. So for the sake of relieving pressure on the tubing, run the radiator on the panel so that the barbs have a little more distance to stretch their legs out. The last thing I will mention is to really watch out for what is in front of the radiator. In a case like this, it's really easy for cables and even the unit's own tubing to get in the way of airflow right by the fans. So I would make sure it's clear. I tuck the tubing into the top right corner like this, and don't worry too much about the PSU exhaust because it still has plenty of space to breathe. Then for that huge mess of fan cables you have now, tuck it just over the unit and use a small Velcro tie or zip tie to anchor it to the top of the case, and there are plenty of anchoring points. That way, not only is your airflow clear, you also minimize the chance of one of those fan cables getting chopped up by your fan blades if it were to somehow fall out. Alright, get your fan splitters ready for configurations part 2. If you're using a splitter cable from the NR200, you'll need at least one splitter for this next part since you're limited to 3 fans otherwise. You could also connect to your motherboard if you have additional fan headers, or if you have a separate fan controller, whatever works for you. But we're going to start to throw a lot more fans at the NR200 now. In the last part, I went over the best configuration for CPU thermals using liquid cooling in the NR200, which was the radiator fans as an intake and the case fans as an exhaust. Now, I also discussed if you want to prioritize the GPU over the CPU, you might consider running the radiator as an exhaust. Now, for more discussion, I'm only going to discuss the 2 options that were summarized at the end of part 1. So case fans will always be running as an exhaust towards the top, and we'll explore the radiator as either an intake or an exhaust. I'm going to introduce the following additional setups to consider: bottom fans, the 92mm case fan, and then we'll go all out and see how you can really maximize the cooling potential of your AIO. Finally, we'll close out by looking at a push-pull setup in this case. And all testing is still done with a Ryzen 7 3700X on a Gigabyte X570 Aorus ITX motherboard with a Zotac 1660 Super amp for the GPU-based tests. It's overclocked out of the box, and even though it's not a hot card, it does give us a decent metric in order to get an idea of how an average video card would interact with your AIO setup. And unless mentioned otherwise, radiator fans were locked at a consistent 67% PWM for consistent RPMs and also noise levels. I'm always running 2 top case fans as an exhaust in all these test scenarios, and I let the case fan RPMs float based on the comparisons because I wanted to get a real-world noise performance due to the impact of different airflow patterns on the various motherboard sensors. So, bottom fans. Putting 2 fans at the bottom of the case didn't really help that much in our air cooling scenarios, but let me convince you that it's a really good idea here. I threw 2 NFA12s that I had lying around to the bottom, and not that you have to use these, since they're a little bit of an overkill as case fans. Just realize your noise levels may be a bit higher depending on which fan you choose, although they probably won't vary that much since your case fans will typically run around 1200 RPM, where the noise difference isn't as huge as, say, a radiator fan running at a much higher RPM. Towards the end of this video, I'll discuss some strategies where if you do spend to get those extra fans, how you might deploy your fans at their best function and maximize your spending power. On the CPU-only test in Blender's 2.82 classroom render, the bottom fans have a minimal impact on case thermals and noise. At least the NFA12s at 1200 RPM are virtually silent. And on top of that, since there's improved airflow across the motherboard, the case fans were running at 50 RPM lower, resulting in slightly lower noise levels. There's virtually no impact here on the CPU thermals, which, well, this is well within sample variation. However, when we run the GPU, throwing in the Unigen test at a slightly lower overclock for the 3700X, we see a huge improvement in GPU thermals. Recall that the CPU thermals for the radiator intake options were already best out of any configuration, with some room to spare. For what is a negligible change to the CPU thermals, the GPU temps improved by a whopping 5 degrees Celsius here. Now that's a significant improvement for what is little to no impact on the CPU. Sound levels did increase slightly, but at a negligible level also because of the addition of 2 fans, which were now spinning faster than the CPU only test. When we flip the radiator fans over to an exhaust position and repeat the same test, we see here that bottom fans also have little impact on CPU temps. And they're running a little bit hotter from the idle GPU exhaust being brought into the radiator, but this is still negligible. Now, sound levels are a bit better, again due to the case fans running at a lower rate due to the perceived better airflow by the motherboard. In the combined Unigen and Blender test, things do get a little worse for the CPU, again, for the reason that more GPU heat is being brought into the path of the exhausting radiator. The GPU performs ever so slightly better, but it was already working pretty well, with little room to improve. Decibel levels increase similarly like the radiator intake test. Now what this tells us is that the addition of bottom fans effectively allows the user to close the GPU thermals gap between the radiator as an exhaust and the radiator as an intake, all while resulting in a negligible CPU temperature increase. If you weren't thinking of adding bottom fans with your AIO, I would strongly recommend it and just run the radiator fans as an intake. At this point, there's no real reason to consider exhausting radiator fans along with the bottom fans since the GPU temps are really close, while you can still retain the excellent CPU thermals. Now, previously I recommended running the radiator fans as an exhaust if you wanted to prioritize your GPU thermals in the dual case fan example. However, if you are running 4 case fans moving air from bottom to top, there's little to no reason to consider any other configuration other than radiator as an intake. In fact, things do get disproportionately worse if you add bottom fans to the radiator exhaust option. Not even playing with the fan curves can get you this close, since I was just trading off CPU thermals for similar GPU thermals. So what this is a truly disproportionate gain for the GPU thermals. Truly, in this scenario, you can have your cake and eat it too. Well, for the cost of case fans and 1 measly decibel. Now, by the time this video goes live, I expect that the new Ampere 3080 and 3090s have been revealed already. And if you're interested in these possibly triple slot monsters, let's hope that you can actually slot at least slim fans under these if you want to get the best configuration. Otherwise, you're looking at only 2 top case fans and that 92mm fan at best. Just as an example with this Asus ROG Strix 5700 XT, which is a 2-slot card that might as well be 3 due to its beefy heatsink, you don't have any options to run bottom fans. I even tried slipping 15mm fans into there, to no avail. The thick GPU combined with just enough sag makes it a no-go. Now, we won't know until we scrutinize the specs of the new Ampere line a bit more, which I know we're all salivating over at this point. However, being able to run 2 25mm fans is actually a pretty good reason to stick to 2-slot cards in this case. So we may have to see how the AIBs look like in the new lineup. For sure, I'll be getting my hands on some of the 3000 series cards when they are out in the wild to test out in this case. Now, if you're an AMD fan in the Navi lineup, I do think your options are pretty slim in this configuration since most cards are at that 2.5 plus slot level. Next, we move on to talk about this little guy here, the 92mm fan. And since there's no good reason to not run 2 bottom fans unless you really don't want to buy extra case fans, let's see what the impact is by running this guy along with the bottom fans. Can we make things better or worse? Now, I'll say this up front, it's really unpredictable, and using it incorrectly can really ruin your thermals. Now, taking a look at the comparison in the combined scenario between the 92mm running as an intake versus an exhaust, combined to the best scenario we just saw with bottom fans only, we see nothing but trouble from introducing it. When running it as an exhaust, the CPU temps are slightly higher, while there's little difference for the GPU. But when you flip it around as an intake, you're totally killing your CPU thermals because it's impeding the intaking radiator fans. The rad fans just can't work as effectively, and the case loses yet another point to pressure equalize. Recall that at this point, all the points of entry and exit are at least partially blocked off, except for the back of the case near the rear AIO. Basically, introducing airflow from a 4th direction really screws things up. In the exhausting radiator scenario, we see little to no benefit from it. If you're running bottom fans, I'd just leave it out and keep the airflow more simple. If you're running only top fans, this actually is a good consideration. Now, I didn't do too much exhaustive testing, but anecdotally, I'll note that running it in the opposite direction of however you're orienting your radiator fans, that will help you out a bit, and there's very little noise penalty from it, assuming this does fit with your radiator. Alright, I hope I've convinced you that at a minimum, 2 bottom case fans are a decent investment. But which one should you get, and how can you best maximize your dollar? Let's drive towards the best configuration possible. First off, if you just want to spend around $25–30, I'd get 2 Arctic P12 fans. Now, the F12 that I have here is pretty good, but these are airflow optimized. And while in a big case they might perform similarly, with intaking side fans and intaking bottom fans with only 2 exhausting fans, there is a little bit of pressure that can build up inside, as evidenced by the effect of just that little 92mm fan. To that end, the P12s are optimized for static pressure and would work well in that scenario. And last I checked, they cost the same, so I'd just get the P12s. They're a little bit better. These fans are a great value and would be fantastic case fans or radiator fans. But for a little bit more, you can get extreme performance benefits from what I'm about to show you. Let's take things to the brink of what's possible. without spending money in the wrong place. Now, the stock Air P120 fans on the X52 are decent fans, performing admirably in the testing. The Noctua U12A performed pretty well in the air cooling test relative to the AIO, but its real strength is the fans it comes with. Now, I'll discuss a little bit more on these fans during the air cooler roundup as well, but what would happen if we took the best aspect of the Noctua U12A, which is the NFA12 fans, and combined it with the AIO? The NFA12 fan is, in my opinion, and I think many will agree, the best 120mm fan on the market. It excels as a radiator fan and a heatsink fan, and while it is an expensive fan to run as a case fan, it's still pretty fantastic in that application due to its low noise penalty. As Ferris Bueller once said, if you have the means, I highly recommend it. Now, we won't be driving any Ferraris out the window today, but I can assure you, this is the Ferrari of computer fans, and they're probably built a bit better too. I'll be honest, the idea of paying $30 for a 120mm fan was laughable when I first saw these, and I was a bit put off by the color. But I took that leap of faith and got up here to see what the hype was all about. And I was a believer from the moment I picked these up. Now, talk about a fan that is solid in weight and heft, well built, well designed, and features a polarizing color scheme, let's say. I mean, nothing says sophistication in your build than all the oohs and ahs and yucks from fellow admirers, right? Now, I won't get into details on why this fan works so well, but suffice to say, the fan blade design and tolerances are best in class, which means that the CFM to noise performance is the best, especially in the middle of the PWM curve. The Sternox material is thick and high quality and therefore has minimal flex during operation. They also sound very pleasant if one could describe a fan as such. There's no high frequency or whine, no hum or rumble in the operational volume. Just a gentle whoosh from the sexy blades cutting through air like a hot knife through butter. I will add that there is a Chromax version in the works, so if you're ready to plop down $40 for a black 120mm fan, get ready to line up. I will fully admit I have a small army of NFA12s ready to throw into different builds because they really are that good. You might say that I have a plethora of NFA12s. Anyhow, a very simple mod to take things close to the max is to replace your standard radiator fans with better fans. And I can't imagine a better fan to run on your AIO radiator than these. Now, running my suite of usual thermal tests, I set out to see just how far we could push CPU performance in the Cooler Master NR200. Wow, color me impressed. I knew the noctuas would be better, but geez, this difference is ridiculous. Taking a look at our first test for CPU thermals in Blender 2.82, with the fans locked at 67% PWM, here the NFA12 equipped X52 performed 2.3 degrees better than the stock Air P120 fans, with the noise performance a whopping 4.7 decibels quieter when the fans were locked at 67% PWM. The NFA12s have a sweet spot towards the middle range of the RPM curve, where the noise to CFM performance is the best out of any 120mm fan. Now that's just incredible. The whole system when idle runs at about 42 decibels, so we're basically at idle levels here at 42 decibels. The two NFA12 fans allowed me to overclock this 3700X higher than any other cooling option in this case. I was able to get to an all-core overclock of 4.4 GHz, successfully running the classroom render while still only at a safe 1.35 volts, which is really decent for a 3700X since it's basically running at 3800X clocks and then some. Now, I don't see why this is something to do regularly, but it is nice to know that it can be done. Now, doing the Unigen test also shows that the NFA12s have roughly the same CPU thermals, well within sample error with no change to GPU thermals. But the biggest improvement here is noise, since at 67% the system is only running at 48 decibels. That's basically all the noise from the 1660 Super. From a value perspective, one fairly effective way to get it close to best system would be to get two NFA12s and replace the stock fans, then use those fans as case fans. The reason is that the NFA12s run really quietly in the middle of the CFM curve, so at typical radiator PWM levels, they will give you the most cooling per decibel. I will caveat this with the fact that in my tested scenario, the Air P120s run pretty loud at 1200 or so RPM, so I would stick those low noise adapters, which come with the NFA12s, on the stock fans to reduce their noise a little bit without impacting thermals at all. The airflow on the bottom really doesn't have to be strong to have a noticeable impact. From a noise perspective, it's a bit better than running two NFA12s at the bottom with the stock radiator fans on the radiator as well. If you're thinking of picking up something with flashy RGB lighting like a Kraken X53, I would actually take a good look at a lower cost 240 AIO such as the Cooler Master ML240L V2. Now I do realize that the jury is still out on whether this iteration is reliable and leak-free in your system, but that risk is still a pretty small one. This is a $70 to $80 240 AIO unit that comes with two RGB sickle flow fans. You can slap two NFA12s on there for roughly the price of an X53, which is about $130 to $140, and you would have great radiator performance with two extra case fans to boot, right? So actually, in my experience, the sickle flow fan is quieter than the Air P120 fans running at 1200 or so RPM. And now for the most extreme example here. For a money is no object build, I'd throw 4 NFA12s at it, running both as case and radiator fans. Now you could even throw 6 NFA12s at it if you're really, really excited. Now, quite frankly, the 4 NFA12s was already past the point of diminishing returns, so I really would stop there unless you want to chase every fraction of a degree or decibel. Now, if you pick up some of the Arctic P12 fans I mentioned earlier, those would also work really well on the rad as well. And you could swap the stock fans on your rad to the case fans, or just swap them all out for P12s. For all of these scenarios, I've tested a fixed fan level, and your tolerance for noise and temps will vary. What this optimization gives you is the flexibility to tweak the rad and GPU fan curves to your tolerance for noise and temperatures. I will point out that at the fan curves tested, these are pretty fantastic temperatures, and you definitely have the ability to drop the fan speeds a little to trade off higher thermals for noise. For example, given a 25 Celsius or 77 Fahrenheit ambient temperature, dropping down the fans to around 50% to 55% for both radiator and GPU fans puts you at around 65 degrees on the CPU and 70 degrees on the GPU. And those are pretty fantastic temperatures for what is an all-out worst case redline system at 45.5 dBA. Now the last iteration I will show you is using 4 rad fans in a push-pull orientation. Since I was already testing with 4 noctua NFA12s in the NR200, I just threw them all on the radiator. 4 NFA12s in a push-pull fashion, intaking on the radiator ought to be icy cool, right? Wait, hold on. It's worse. The fans were locked at the same PWM signal at 67%, and yes, noise would naturally be a little worse since we added 2 fans, but why are the thermals worse? Well, say it ain't so. I had to do a double take. That doesn't make any sense, right? Surely something was set up incorrectly, right? Now, just to do a sanity check, I ran the radiator in open air in both push-pull and pull-only configurations. Now, the push-pull, as expected, outperformed the 2-fan configuration by 1 degree. That makes sense. So why was it worse when installed in the case? When I checked the case, it was immediately obvious why the thermals got worse. Instead of having room for airflow, the space limitation from the thicker radiator configuration was making things worse. Now there's barely any space between the fan and the PSU shroud. In fact, even the pump head is super close to the fan. So there's increased resistance against airflow, and it can't be effectively exhausted out by the case fans either. So in effect, there's just choked up airflow in the case because of the extra fan and extra thickness. The case penalty for 2 radiator fans in this case was 2 degrees, which is pretty reasonable. The case penalty for running 4 radiator fans in this case in a push-pull orientation was 5.4 degrees, and that is a huge difference. So, is a push-pull in this case worth it? Nah, not by a long shot. Now that doesn't mean it's never worth it. Certainly in a case where the radiator has a reasonable amount of space, push-pull should at a minimum be the same. But especially in an SFF case like this NR200, you have to be careful. More isn't always better. And in this case, it's actually worse. So if you want to do the push-pull configuration, you also need to have the same fans as well, which is yet another level of cost complexity. So we've gone to the limits of what you can reasonably accomplished in terms of cooling and with an AIO in this case, and we've also explored just how good cooling can get with just the addition of 2 bottom fans. At a minimum, if you're running an AIO, you would really be doing your system a favor by adding 2 bottom fans, intaking at the bottom, exhausting at the top, and running the radiator as an intake. Now, 2 case fans by themselves aren't bad, and depending on your GPU choice, you may not even have that option, and you can follow my recommendations from part 1 for that. However, if you can, honestly, just the additional 2 extra fans is a no-brainer from a value perspective. So we'll say goodbye to the liquid AIO testing for now until I get to the NR200P. And next up, I'll wrap up air cooling with a few more air coolers thrown into the mix, and then I can finally sum up the air cooling versus liquid cooling discussion for the NR200. Again, a big thank you for all your continued participation and feedback. Seeing that this information is helpful for your builds and plans makes doing this all the more enjoyable. If you're picking up fans, the case, or anything else you found helpful that I mentioned, it really supports the channel by using the links down below. Also, it's always so appreciated that if you enjoyed the video to click like, subscribe, and share the videos in your communities. Until next time, good luck with all your builds in the NR200. May you find all the SFX power supplies that you want in stock, and take care.